Good afternoon, good evening, salam, wherever you are in the world. My name is Katarzyna and I'm a member of MACFEST team. I'm based in France at the moment, in a beautiful southern France. We've got wonderful weather today. And this is a discussion on conversion to Islam in Britain and future of Muslim minorities, where Yahya Birt Yahya Birt, a British-American well-known writer and academic, will be in conversation with our host, Dr. Shamim Miah. And Dr. Shamim is a senior lecturer at the Department of Education and Community Studies at the University of Huddersfield. He's an award-winning author, and his research, expertise, and interest focus around the educational policy and Muslim communities in Britain. So I hope you enjoy it, and over to you, Dr. Shamim.
Rahman Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I welcome. I am going to just change the screen. So if you just give me 1 second, and then we'll start. Okay, so I've been really looking forward to this conversation with Yahya Birt, who's a dear friend of mine. I've known him for many years, so I've been really looking forward to having this conversation. So for the purpose of for those people who not know Yahya, I'm just going to read out a short bio, and hopefully throughout our conversation you'll be able to unpick some of the meanings around his publications in particular. So Yahya Birt, I mean, I would argue, is not only a community historian, but is one of our public intellectuals here in Britain, who was taught at University of Leeds. He's published many peer-reviewed journal articles on Islam in Britain. And he's also authored and co-authored a number of publications, in particular dealing with British secularism and religion. But I think the key areas that we will be spending our time today is his research around Islam in Victorian Britain. There's a number of publication that we'll be focusing on, but I just thought if I can just flag up some of the wider work that he's been involved with. So, for example, back in 2016, he co-authored a book titled British Secularism and Religion. In 2021, he published Islam in Victorian Liverpool, and most recently, he authored the collected poems of Abdullah Quilliam. But he's also a founding series editor at Oxford British Muslim Studies through the Oxford University Press. In 2022, he published his first poetry collections, Pandemic Pilgrimage, reflecting upon the performance of Umrah during COVID lockdown. But I mean, that's just part of his biography. He's also involved with the Ayan Institute as a research director there, and his 2022 well-received and reviewed a report titled Ummah at the Margins: The Past, the Present, and the Future of Muslim Minorities was actually published with Ayan Institute. As far as his hobbies, I'm surprised that he actually has time for hobbies. He enjoys walking and being grumpy. And that might be one of the questions for people to actually ask, what exactly grumpiness actually means. But he lives in West Yorkshire with his family and a cat. Do you have the name of the cat, Yahya?
Anise.
Anise, okay, okay, right, okay. And for those people who are active on social media, Yahya can be reached on at YBirt. That's at YBIRT. So that's a short biography. And if I can just explain the format of today. So obviously this is a conversation. We have a series of slides, I think 5 slides in total, where we kind of unpick some of the key areas around Muslim conversions, cosmopolitanism, and the whole notion of the Islamicate. We'll look at his works around Islam in Victorian Britain. And also we will hopefully get into some of his works around his poetry of Abdullah Quilliam, but also the much recent publication of Fatima Cates as well. So there's a lot to actually get through. We will hopefully try and wrap everything up for about a 10 past 1. Give the opportunities for people to actually ask questions as well. So okay, so without further ado, we welcome Yahya Birt. So okay, so if we just quickly kind of move on. Okay, let me see if my okay, so why is it I'm not allowed to okay, okay, can everybody see this next slide? Is that okay?
Yes.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. Right, okay, so I thought it might be a useful starting point. Yahya, just give us a kind of a kind of update, if you like, about you know, the overall kind of work. I mean, in terms of the the key influences that's you know, the key people, the influences can shape your kind of life and your work.
Well, first of all, let me salam alaikum, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whichever time zone you're tuning in from. I'm very honored to be having this conversation with my dear friend, Dr. Shamim Miah, who himself is a public intellectual and always hides his light under a bushel, mashallah. And also very honored to be joining MACFEST in its 5th year. And I hope it can go from strength to strength, as it obviously appears to be doing already. So, yeah, I mean, look, I guess as I get older, Shamim, I feel that more and more that our influences are very autobiographical. And so, you know, we are trying to synthesize and pull out, I guess, general lessons from our particular lives and experiences. And as I get older, I try to be more explicit about those influences, if you know what I mean. I mean, I guess I don't believe in false universalisms, but I believe that every particular experience has something to say to the universal, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, yeah.
There's something human in every particular experience. Let me put it that way. So I guess I guess when I was younger, I used to kind of think that abstract ideas would somehow save the day, but I'm much more skeptical about that now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think it's about seeing what is human in our own particular individual experiences and our lives in community. I guess this is sort of what I'm trying to do today, I think, is to kind of bring together, try to explain the logic behind the different aspects of the work that I've been doing in the last few years, and how it all ties together at a personal level.
Okay. I don't know. Yeah. So does that mean that you're less of an idealist and more of a pragmatist? Is that another way of summarizing what you just said? Or
no, I think I'm saying that I think ideas should be rooted in real, even idealism should be rooted in real experience, in particular experience. That's all I'm really saying. I mean, I guess part of my view is that we live in an age of rising ethno-nationalism, and part of what I'm trying to say is that whatever it means to be British, it can't be very narrow. And what is it that the Muslim minority in Britain can say to that conversation? What is it that converts to Islam can say to that conversation? And I guess what I'm saying is I would like to say that we are a community that, yes, is located in Britain, but also is part of a universal tradition, an ummah. And ummah is an ethical concept. and it is about a community that spans all human cultures, believes in a higher ethical calling. And so, you know, we always sort of sit located in Britain, but also with the universal horizon or view. And so that means, you know, that yes, we're rooted in Britain, but we're also cosmopolitans. We look beyond Britain to humanity. And we are, you know, I think islamicate is a term that has come in academia, but is hopefully something that we could popularize in our discussions as a community. So it means that, you know, any kind of cultural influence of Islam that goes beyond the boundaries of faith, if you see what I mean. So something could be related to or influenced by or in sort of kind of cultural synthesis with Islam, Islamic culture, but it's not bounded by faith per se. And I would say that parts of Britain today are parts of Islamicate, of the Islamicate. I mean, to make a bit of a joke about it, but it was even 20 years ago now that the late Robin Cook said that chicken tikka masala was Britain's national dish, you know. So I mean, that in of itself is a dish that was actually created in Britain.
True,
For the British palate, if you know what I mean. But obviously created by Muslim, by British Muslims in the catering trade in the 70s and 80s, whether it's Glasgow or Birmingham or Bradford. I'm not sure who claims the title, but you know, that's just an example of how we should see Britishness as an open-ended project, an open project, not a closed project. And that's certainly the kind of post-Brexit. That's the kind of Britain that I want to live in and I want to argue for, even fight for, to be honest with you.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah. I mean, I thought that those kind of opening observations quite pertinent to, I guess, some of the key works that you've actually been involved with as well. So, I mean, it's nice to hear the kind of broader picture that you've kind of laid out, and hopefully the next couple of slides will allow us to actually kind of drill a little bit more deeper into some of those kind of conversation. And I just thought that it might be useful to segue into this report that you authored at the margin, the past, present, and the future of Muslim minorities. As I was reading the report, I just thought it was really interesting because of there's some of the central arguments that you actually make. And I think the first point of observation is the fact that you know, Muslims play a significant role as minorities throughout the world. I think there's some useful statistics that you can have shared, saying that 22% of the Muslims actually live as minorities. But I mean, thinking much more kind of historically, I mean, Muslims within the margins have played a significant role in a number of kind of intellectual pursuits. I mean, if you think about the hadith literature, I mean, most of the kind of the hadith, muhaddithun actually didn't come from, you know, the Middle East. They came from Central Asia, you know, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, in those, you know, in those particular kind of regions, if you like. And then I just thought it's a useful way that, I mean, of tying in the importance of Muslims as living as minorities, and the cultural capital that we kind of use as a way of shaping some of the conversations around Islam in the world. So I'm just wondering if you could perhaps just offer some of your kind of the insights, or what the key kind of headlines that you're actually flagging up in this report, and its importance for Muslim converts, but also Muslims living as as minorities.
Well, I think that I mean, the thing is that because we have so much ground to cover today, I thought that it would be hard for me to talk about the whole report. I definitely would suggest people go and give it a read. You can download it from the Ayan Institute website as a free, PDF. But in the report, what I'm trying to do is to get Muslims to see not to have a kind of internalize a kind of sense of only of being victims of Islamophobia, or at the same time having kind of false overconfidence. You know, what I guess I'm trying to say, and kind of falling into kind of despair or kind of false utopianism. What I was hoping was that we could develop a kind of grounded, pragmatic, what are the next 3 steps that we need to take to strengthen ourselves as a community? And so, you know, in the report, I talk about a distinction between hard and soft power. And soft power is a persuasive power. And this is really where I do a lot of my work, is about in the cultural space. And so I wanted, you know, quite often when people think about power, they think about power as coercion. But for Muslim minorities, you know, it's obvious to me that a great deal of our power, if you like, is creative, it's persuasive power. And therefore, if we focus on this aspect and give it due attention, give creativity true attention, then I think we will be able to kind of bear witness, if you like, to the truth of our community's experience and our community's faith and so on. I mean, it's, if you like, you know, it's not for us to assimilate as such, you know, it's for us as a creative minority, you know, we're in a kind of third space, you know, we're not entirely defined by the nation, and we're not entirely defined by kind of Western universalism. You know, what I kind of try to say in the report is that the most subversive thing today is to claim a universalism and not to be relativistic. You know, in other words, to say that, you know, we live in a pluriversal world in which there are different universalisms. And so there is an Islamic universalism. What does it have to say to the world? Okay. Not only about itself, but about the state of the world. And so making that kind of claim itself is highly subversive today, when we're very encouraged to be, you know, postmodern, to be relativistic, and to not make universal claims. You know, all universal claims are false under kind of postmodern epistemology. So trying to claim the contrary to that is actually highly subversive today. And so, you know, what is it that, you know, the Ummah is? You know, if the Ummah as minorities, 400 million Muslims who live as minorities, you know, they're connected to every major world civilization, in Africa, in China, in Russia, India, in America. There are significant Muslim minorities. So if Muslims are able, if you like, to successfully marry their faith and culture together, then in a way, this is a way for a global ecumen to work in its own right, the Ummah as a model of human coexistence per se, you know, in which all cultures come together. And so this is a different vision of universalism. It's not the one that goes from Plato to NATO. It's another claim to universalism. But, you know, it's, you know, any expression of Islamic universalism or Muslim power is automatically seen as frightening, as retrogressive, as stepping back in time and so on. But maybe I'm saying that if we're going to renew ourselves and we're going to move to a pluriversal post-West world, then we all, Europeans particularly, have to be more receptive to non-Western form universal claims. And if we're going to have a genuine global conversation, then it has to be a pluriversal conversation, I think, rather than a postmodern one. You know, postmodern one means that we can no longer make claims that matter. We can just be in our cultural niches. And I don't think that that's going to work in a multipolar world, a post-West world. So I think that, you know, the Ummah, the idea of the re-energized Ummah is a really important part of that. And Muslim minorities as cosmopolitan populations, they have something to say in this new multipolar world, I believe, of great importance.
So can I just get you to unpick the whole notion of Ummah? Because in the report, you kind of move away from this notion as the Ummah, as a qawm, as people, but you kind of anchor the whole concept of Ummah within like the ethical framework. And in doing so, you're kind of referring back to the Medinian constitution, where the whole notion of the Ummah, which was more kind of inclusive, as a category that kind of included, people of the book, etc. So can you just kind of unpick this concept for us, just in case if people are not kind of familiar with that kind of idea, because a lot of people's in their imagination, the Ummah means Muslims. It's as if like it's the people, it's brotherhood, etc. But you have a different reading of it.
Yeah, I think that there are two elements to Ummah that seem to sit in tension with each other, but they're not. The first is from the Quran. And so the idea of Muhammadan Ummah is, one that is monotheistic, upholds, is an ethical vision, and is one that upholds justice, and enjoins good, forbids wrong. So it's an active ethical ideal. On the other side, in practice, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in Medina, in his later career, he sets up a charter, a Medina charter, between the Muslims, the Jews, and the pagan Arab tribes of Medina. And it's a covenant of mutual security and cooperation, if you like, the basic kind of grounds upon which diverse peoples come together and live within a political system, within a polity. I wouldn't say it was a constitution, but I would say that it's sort of the grounds upon which political order works anywhere. And so in that, Ummah as a political concept is not defined by faith, is defined by mutually agreed covenant of political cooperation and mutual protection and security. So I think that these two notions, kind of universal ethical vision of Ummah, and believing in God, believing in the Prophet, believing in justice and ethics, and coming together in a mutually agreed covenant of mutual security and cooperation that's not bound by faith. Both of these things come out of the Quran and the Prophet's life. So both of these things, these both two kind of strands of Ummah, they come together. And I think that there's enough there.
Hello.
For us to be able to work in a multipolar world successfully, I think. Well, can you hear me all right, Shamim?
Yeah. I can just about, yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So, sorry, do you have another question or so?
Oh, sorry, yeah. So you just froze there. It might be the internet at at my place. But no, that's quite helpful actually. No, that's really valuable because the point that I was going to kind of make is that this idea that the frame of reference that people actually use as a way of constructing their ideas, does it come out of the Western kind of a intellectual heritage? And the point that you're making quite convincingly is that the whole notion of inclusive Ummah comes out from our own kind of heritage, if you like. I mean, it's there within the Seerah literature, and it's there in the Quran, etc. Okay, so it might be useful to kind of move on to our next kind of a point of conversation, if it's okay.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so can't even get the next slide to go actually. Oh God. Okay, yeah, and this is to do with kind of converts as creative minorities. So the first conversation was very much about your report about kind of the whole notion of Ummah and cosmopolitan ideas, etc. And this is more conversation to do with the conference that's created minorities. And I just thought, just before we kind of move on to the discussions about the first, second, and third wave of kind of a convert, I was just wondering if you could just perhaps, you know, in terms of your own kind of autobiographical kind of journey, really, because you can't, I mean, I'm one of those individuals that I feel that you can't actually separate, you know, the text from the individual. I mean, obviously it's, I mean, you started off by saying that most of our works is kind of autobiographical. So I'm just wondering, you're just thinking through this idea of kind of you know, autobiography. I'm just wondering if you could just share, you know, just a summary of your own journey, you know, to Islam, and in particular, if you can actually focus on whether or not there was a, you know, road to Damascus experience that everybody wants to kind of, you know, so I'm just wondering if you can just chart, you know, just give us a thumbnail sketch, if you like.
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, that there are as many ways to Islam as there are individuals, and the road to Damascus experience of Paul of Tarsus is not the template for all conversions. I think conversions come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. Mine was meeting my own saint, my own Islamic saint, who was a wisecracking metallurgist from Lahore, who I met at the end of the 1980s. His name was Falahuddin, and he was like an older brother to me. And, you know, we don't have the time to kind of go into how he influenced me over a number of years and so on, but he was my entry point to Islam. But I speak about it at greater length in an interview I did a couple of years ago, which is, you can see on the screen here on the right-hand side. And if anybody suffers from insomnia and they want to get to sleep at night more early, then they can listen to it on YouTube. I mean, I guess I kind of see my, what I find useful is to put my individual story into kind of a wider picture of these three waves of conversion to Islam, which is kind of how I've tried to set it out. My story is very much part of the third wave, rather than the first two, which I've studied academically, but I've lived the third, and so that is autobiographical. I guess it is autobiographical, as that you want to understand the bigger historical picture that you yourself are part of.
Do you want to just quickly just go through it? I'm just thinking of, you know, people might not necessarily be familiar with the academic literature around the first and the second wave. If you could just give us a, you know, just gives a summary as to the journey. Because I mean, if you could just touch upon the first wave, because that's the remaining of the slide, we kind of drilled down on some of those. But if you could just give us once again, just a thumbnail sketch about the first and the second wave.
Yeah, I mean, I'll probably just describe all three briefly, because I've not talked about my conversion in the context of the third wave. But the first, basically, historically in Britain, there's always been for centuries contact between Britain and the world of Islam, you know, whether it was through trade or empire or diplomacy and so on. So you had, you know, individuals converting. But what I'm talking in previous centuries, but what I'm talking about here is sort of something more like a wave of conversion. And that really happens in Britain. The first one is between 1880 and 1920, and you get the first mosques. And the first three mosques in Britain all had converts, were all missionary-minded mosques. They all had outreach programs, and converts were either involved in the founding of these mosques or were involved in the running of them, and were very much involved in that, in promoting Islam as, if you like, as a missionary faith, if I can put it that way. This tied in with streams of Islamic modernism, themes of religious syncretism. You know, there was still a kind of, in a way, these were still transitional movements, and strongly influenced in a kind of synthesis between kind of Protestant Christianity and Sunni Islam, and streams of Islamic modernism. And it also tied in politically with things like trying to save the Ottoman Caliphate, and emerging anti-imperialism. So a very interesting period, and some major converts emerged during this time. And then the second wave really is to do in the post-war period with the counterculture movement in the 1960s, although you had an earlier wave of that in jazz, but really the kind of, you know, the 1960s counterculture. Now, I know that a lot of people associated, when there was a search for alternative spiritualities and the birth of the New Age movement and so on in the 1960s, people associated that more with Hinduism, Buddhism. But there was always a strain that was attached to Sufism and Islam as well, in two parts, through two areas, North Africa and India, really, the subcontinent. Those are really the two main areas of influence at the time. And it was really Sufism, the mystical dimension of Islam, that was attractive to converts. And still there was an element of people, like in the first wave, having to travel to find Islam, or at the very least be part of a port city where they would meet Muslims, the few Muslims that were in Britain at the time. But really it was about people traveling, really. What really distinguishes the third wave really from the other two is that this is really not so much about travel anymore. This is about mass contact, where you've had a, you know, what was originally a very small Muslim population in Britain at, say, around about 1900, it was under 10,000. Even in around about 1970, it might have been around about 250,000, something like that. But now we're talking in this decade of it being nearly 4 million. And so in this period after about 1980, you know, really most converts are coming through direct contact with Muslim communities settled in Britain. And some of those communities have carried with them traditions of their conversion-minded traditions. Let's say they emphasize dawah, the call to Islam, as a key part of their work. And really, there were three groups that have done that in this period more than any other. One is the Tablighi Jamaat, which is the movement that I came through. So the brother who brought me to Islam, he was an ardent member of the Tablighi Jamaat. And I know that there's a kind of officially, they're not supposed to preach to non-Muslims, they're supposed to revive Islam amongst lapsed Muslims. But in reality, actually, there's a lot of dawah that goes on inside the Tablighi Jamaat. It's kind of like a underappreciated element, I guess, of the unofficial work that they've done over the decades. The other group is the Salafi group, which has become very important, I think, in the last 30 years in Britain, particularly amongst working class peoples of different ethnic backgrounds, but have been a very important vector of conversion. And the third one, I think, is a kind of carry on really from the second wave of Sufism. But I think the Sufi movement that's done the most is the Ba'alawis, who were the Yemenis, who were the Sayyids. The Sayyids are the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad through his grandson Hussein. A family of scholarly and pious Sayyids of Yemen, the Ba'alawis of Hadramaut Valley in the Yemen. They have a historic role in spreading Islam throughout in the Indian Oceanic trade, you know, in East Africa and in Southeast Asia, across the Indian Ocean world. But in recent decades, in the 20th century and beyond, they've become instrumental in promoting Islam as a missionary faith in places like Britain and America and elsewhere. So it's these three movements really that have done the most. And in this third wave, we've also seen, I think, converts embracing the sort of totality of options that you find within the House of Islam today, whether that's Sunni or Shia. Converts have been very involved, I think, in the translation movement. I think helping to pioneer that, to bring the Islamic intellectual heritage into English. I think converts have played an outsized role in that translation movement, but now they've been joined by many others. And the development of English as an Islamicate language now, a major language, language of intellectual output and devotion for Muslims around the world, not just in Britain, obviously, but English has become an Islamicate language like Urdu and Turkish and Persian and Arabic, obviously not with their pedigree, but I think it is joining those ranks.
Mhm. That's very helpful, actually. Can I just pick up on just a couple of points, really? And the first point is this idea that a lot of people actually argue the separation of Islam and culture, when in reality, actually, Islam actually permeates through culture. What Dr. Umar Farooq Abdullah talks about Islam as the cultural imperative. Now, just wondering, if you look at some of the literature around, say, for example, the United States, this is kind of an argument that a lot of people actually make to say that, look, Islam actually has a history in the US prior to the mass migration of Muslims. So the way in which Black Islam actually manifests itself through the culture of Black history, Black memory, etc. And I'm just thinking within the UK context, how does the convert experiences manifest? Does that manifest in its own unique way, or does it permeate through existing kind of experiences of Muslims from the Indian subcontinent?
That's a great question. I mean, I think we'll come on to this later on in today's interview, but there are I think that when in the first and second waves, there was more space for converts in Britain to experiment with synthesizing their culture with their faith, their new faith of Islam. And there was a great deal of more experimentation, I would say, in a bit of a silo, if I can put it that way. In the third wave, I see something different going on, which is that you have a multicultural Muslim community, which is creating a kind of British Muslim synthesis. And in that synthesis, converts play a role, but not the role. It's like a dialogical role where different cultural influences are coming together to create a kind of cosmopolitan British Muslim identities, and converts are part of that.
Okay.
There was always a kind of strand amongst converts that they want. Some of them had this sort of idea that there has to be a kind of an indigenous British Islam. Almost a kind of white British Islam, if I can put it like that. But such attempts have always been contested and kind of stillborn, really. They've never really borne fruit. And I would suggest because, and particularly now that we're in the third wave, with the largest number of conversions coming through cultural contact with migrant and settled Muslim communities in Britain, I think it's got to be cosmopolitan openness that is defining whatever British Islam looks like in the future. And as I've kept on saying, I don't think it can be an island mentality. I think it has to be attached to the universal ethics of Islam and be cosmopolitan and open to the world.
Okay, fantastic. No, so whilst we're on the convert story, if you can just quickly move to the, oh God, I don't know why.
You've done all right so far, Shamim Miah.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to technology, always something goes wrong anyway. So I'm doing relatively well anyway. So anyway, if you can, because this has been your one of the major areas of contributions that you've actually made in your, in your writing, your thinking. So and then you're using that as a way of developing, constructing this idea of cosmopolitan British Muslims. So if you could just talk us through these key areas of developments within the first wave of Muslim converts, and I think it's really it's fascinating because Britain is quite unique. I think the US, has an exception as well, in the sense that there was a community here before, Muslim mass migration. So if you could just talk through that, it'll be, really helpful. And in particular, if you can just lay the foundation of the Quilliam community in Liverpool, the Liverpool Muslim Institute. So if you can just going to thrash out those, the key developments that are taking place in this period.
Yeah, I mean, I think as I said, the first wave saw the first 3 mosques and the first signs of organized Muslim community life in Britain, and the first of these was in Liverpool, and it was established by converts to Islam, it became a community of the convert aspect of the community, maybe numbered about 250. The community was active for about 20 years, from the end of the 1880s up to the end of up to 1908, and it was mainly a kind of working class community. And it came out of a kind of movement that was known to campaign against alcoholism, and it looked to actually reduce alcohol consumption or even to end it. And that was the temperance movement. And all the 3 founding converts from this community actually all came out of that social movement, the Temperance League. And initially they worked on their own. They admitted themselves to Islam. Nobody took their Shahada. In fact, their Shahada only got taken about maybe 2 or 3 years after the community had been founded by an Indian Muslim lawyer who came up to help them out. But at that point, they'd been working on their own with quite a lot of hostility and local hostility. And they got, but they gained huge attention, and this is where this kind of this translation that we did is by an Ottoman journalist, a newspaper owner called Sami Yusuf Asma'i, who was from Cairo. And by the time he came to Liverpool in 1895, the community had become since the big news of the Ummah. So you could read about the weekly goings on of this convert community from in Cairo or in Istanbul or in Delhi. It was weekly. This is what his travelogue tells us. And in Cairo at the time, you're like, all this hype about this community, is it some kind of nefarious imperial, propaganda, false flag operation or something like that? There was quite a lot of suspicion. And other people saying, no, they seem to be genuine and so on. And so they were goading this guy, Asma'i, and say, look, you've been to Britain already. Why didn't you go to Liverpool and find out what's really going on? So he said, okay, I'll do it. And so he went and he spent 33 days there and writes this account in Ottoman Turkish. And we found it a few years ago, and a team of us worked together to translate and edit it and bring it out. And it's really hilarious. It's a very funny book. It's very witty, and he's quite a skeptic. I have to be honest with you as well. But it's a fun read. It's not what you would imagine when you look at the cover. But what the cover shows is a kind of very cosmopolitan community. Where you have India, you're being visited by, there's a description of a visit by the Crown Prince of Afghanistan to the mosque, and he gives the mosque 2 bags of gold, to build a purpose-built mosque, which never got built actually, which was a point of contention at the time, why that never happened. You have Maulana Barakatullah, who was the Imam at the time, who goes on to become a very influential pan-Islamist an anti-imperialist figure of the early 20th century. In the subcontinent, a really important figure, but at that time he was the Imam in Liverpool. And then you have like these local working class people who'd converted and so on. So, we're trying to bring the color of the characters to life, not just focusing on the founder figure of the Quilliam, but actually the whole community, to give that kind of feel for a community. And that's where that's part of what the work I've been doing, trying to understand how the community itself sort of operated.
Excellent. So So the point that you're trying to make here is that the British Muslims in the first period has a very much of a cosmopolitan outlook. Is that, I mean, are we just talking about culture there? Is there class involved, or I mean, because I mean, is there an element of class, is what in terms of gender roles, etc.? I mean, obviously we'll get into the gender kind of.
Yeah, I think we can come on to the gender with Fatima Cates, but in terms of class, yeah, it was a working class community. They stood up for Lascar rights, which I think was very significant. Quilliam used to take the shipping companies to court if they didn't honor back pay for the Lascars. And that quite often happened quite a lot. But also they courted the visiting notables, and Quilliam got Birt onto a kind of letter writing campaign to woo the philanthropists and the potentates of the independent Muslim states. So it's through Birt that they gain access to the Afghan court, and that explains how the Crown Prince ends up visiting the mosque. Coming all the way from Afghanistan as part of a state visit, which was backed by the British. But why he came all the way to Liverpool specifically to give them that money, it wasn't an accident. That was so they were a working class community, but they had a few professionals like Quilliam, a lawyer, and others who I guess were part of that leadership. But at the same time, they also were involved in trade unionism as well, and the community. So it's a very interesting story politically as well, between a kind of pragmatic getting on with the powers that be, but also some elements of I would say, a champion of the rights of the poor and disenfranchised, and certainly a kind of early anti-racism. I mean, I don't know if that's a bit anachronistic to say that, but the mosque did endorse, if you like, mixed heritage marriages, so we say, which were very kind of controversial at the time. But the mosque conducted nikahs along those lines.
But there's a kind of interesting links between some of the conversation around the soft power element that you were discussing in the report, and the soft power being manifested within the first community, if you like. I mean, through their publication, of the Crescent and various other, national, international, publication that they've got. And if you just think through some of the types of conversations that was listed in the Crescent about the type of discussions that was happening, at the mosque, it wasn't just religious focus; it was much more broader, to do with politics, poetry, etc. So I'm just wondering if you can just build a picture about what type of conversation, because it seems to me, there's a lot that we as Muslims living in the UK now can actually learn from that community, because it's much more broader. It's more enriched conversation that they were actually having, to do with science and various other things as well.
Yeah, I think that there was a strong aspect of whole education for deprived communities. So they provided free adult education classes. They had a literary debating society. They taught science at the Liverpool Muslim Institute. They had a photographic lab. They had a museum. The journals that they published from 1893 were highly influential. They probably went to more than 80 countries around the world, and was widely read as, for instance, Al-Manar, the Lighthouse, the famous Arab reform journal of Rashid Rida and Muhammad Abduh, probably as widely read, if not more widely read than that journal. And so it was sort of created its own kind of pan-Islamist hub in English, which is a unique first, really. And I think that, in Britain, we have had a tradition of journalist activists. I think about people like the late Kalam Siddiqui, who set up the Muslim Institute in London, and the Crescent International, which was published in 3 languages. And is still published today. Or you had late Fuad Nehdi, who set up the Q News. So I think there's always been a strand of, or Hasha Faruqi, and Impact International. So there's always been a strand of journalists, activists, if you like, and Quilliam is one of those, as well as Mashir Hussain Kudwai Marmajit Pickthall, who set up Muslim Outlook at the end of the First World War, Deuce Muhammad Ali, who sets up the African Times and Oriental Review. So we've always had, like, going back to the late 19th century, we've always had a British Muslim tradition of journalist activists, if I can put it that way. We've also got now critical Muslim as well that you're involved with. So I think we do realize the power of publication, and we have used that soft power, I think, but we don't have a sense of having a tradition. If you see what I mean, we're a bit siloed in our efforts, and I don't believe we have the kind of fruitful conversation where we connect, join the dots, and we see ourselves as furthering a tradition and developing it and adapting it for the age. But I think that would help us. Part of why I do this work is for us to have a sense of local Islamicate tradition, if you like, our tradition of cosmopolitan rootedness that goes back further than we think. We're not always reinventing the wheel. We're actually building on a tradition. And I think that's important for our sense of confidence and that we have in what we're doing.
Brilliant. Alhamdulillah. So, I mean, whilst we're on that subject of soft power, etc., I was just wondering, you've obviously mentioned about the community in Liverpool and in particular Abdullah Quilliam, but he seems to be like a really fascinating kind of individual, because he was obviously he was an eclectic reader. He had a number of interests in different elements. But I mean, you've obviously spent some time focusing on his poetry. So I mean, I was just wondering if you could just offer, I don't know, I mean, I think we've got some time, if you can offer some readings, but also if you can just give us a synoptic overview about, what are the themes that he was actually, unpicking in his poetry. Was it devotional? Was it political? Was it social? I mean, if you can just offer some observations on those as well, that would be great.
Well, I mean, like Quilliam wasn't, I mean, it's exhausting to follow his life, because he had a double career as a journalist and a lawyer. He had two families that he kept up, and more wives. We'll talk about that later. But somehow he was still an occasional poet, and probably wrote about a poem a month, something like that, and we collected for the first time actually 40 years of his poetry writing, which we found covers multiple genres. Sometimes it's very political, pointed, almost commenting on current affairs. Other times it's romantic, it's devotional. So some of the poems are written to be sung as hymns. This was a hymn singing mosque. As I said to you, the first wave really had some aspects of being transitional and hybrid between Protestant Christianity and Sunni Islam. So you see that, for instance, in the liturgical practice of the community, they would, in the first mosque in Liverpool, they would sing hymns on the Sunday evening, and they would set, hymns of the day, famous tunes, that they would change the lyrics to be to reflect Islamic monotheism. And so some of the poems that he wrote, were designed to be set to song. For instance, he set the national anthem to rewrote the words to the national anthem in 1901. So to the tune of "God Save the King." It was "God bless the Muslim cause. Bless all who keep thy laws and do the right. Uphold the Muslim band in this and every land. Give them full strength to stand firm in the fight." And it goes on, but probably one of his most militant poems. And then he's got humorous poems. But he came from a Manx background. That's the Isle of Man in the Irish Sea between Britain and Ireland. And so he was very proud of that Celtic heritage of his. So several of the poems refer to Manx history and folklore. and also odes to the landscape of the Isle of Man, where he had a holiday home. And so it's a very varied collection. I think the most interesting thing we found was that in his later life, after he left Liverpool, he wrote a kind of mystical collection of poems. And in some ways, these are the most profound spiritual poems that he wrote. And he did it under a kind of pseudonym of being posing as, he kind of covered his own poetry by calling it the kind of translations of a Mevlevi Ottoman poet from the 16th century called Sheikh Harun Abdullah, but actually it was just Abdullah Quilliam writing his own poems. And but they're quite remarkable poems and quite show real development in his I think in his religious knowledge, learning and journey. Because really, if you go back to the 1880s, he was still sort of teaching himself from 19th century Orientalism. They were just using a translation of the Quran by George Sale, George Irving's Life of the Prophet. But during the First World War, he'd come a long way, and he'd spent time in Morocco and in Turkey, had met several ulama. And I think that depth of knowledge and understanding is evident in his later poetry, which makes it very interesting, even though it's in his sort of post-Liverpool phase when he was running this first mosque. The poetry is in the later poetry is very interesting. You're muted, Shamim.
Yeah. So if we can just move on to the next aspect of the discussion. I mean, this is obviously much more recent work that you've been involved with, and I was just wondering, because your work around Quilliam and in particular this book as well, it's quite warts and all. I mean, it doesn't kind of eulogize the community. It kind of looks at the community and highlights some of the key points of merit, but also is quite robust enough and has that kind of confidence to kind of discuss some of the shortcomings of that community as well. I mean, I just found that this book to be really fascinating because it's quite intersectional. I mean, this reminds me of what Bell Hooks was basically saying about writing in particular about race and gender. And she was saying that Black women have to navigate racism and also sexism as well, patriarchy, etc. And it just reminded me of her statement as I was reading this book, because I mean, here you have Fatima Cates is one of the most kind of important kind of pillars of the community, but her experience is she has to navigate. I mean, Islamophobia, within the streets of Liverpool, but also domestic violence at home as well. So I just thought, I mean, was that an intentional thing to do? I mean, in terms of, discuss the community, from its kind of holistic kind of perspective, if you like, looking at the warts and all. I mean, I'm just wondering if you could just talk through that, because I just thought, I mean, to me, it shows that the community is quite mature enough, to discuss some of those kind of elements, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that I get a lot. My approach is, you tell history to the best of your ability. You try to step back. You try to look at what the sources say, and you try your best to as clearly as possible to reflect on those, and not to cover things over or to create a kind of hagiographical, boulderized kind of version. So I would say kind of warts and all, but with the eye of charity. I mean, in other words, you're trying to understand people in their time, with their background, their influences, their understanding, the choices that were available to them, and why they acted the way that they did, to the best of your ability. But obviously, we all know that we're still looking at that with the spectacles of the present. We'll never fully go back into the past, but you can just try your best to do that. So it's a sort of humble endeavor, trying your best to do that. I think that our community, there's definitely a big tendency in our community to want to have heroes and villains. So pure whiter than white heroes and blacker than black villains. But I'm also, influenced by my wife here, who's a professional historian. I mean, when she looks at the classical Arabic historiographical tradition of the medieval period, so we look at medieval Egypt from the Fatimids to the Ayyubids and the Mamluks, Ibn Khalduns and the Makrizis and the Ibn Furats and all the others, or even going back to Tabari, they do warts and all. They look at multiple perspectives. They use multiple sources. They use in a non-sectarian way. They're using all kinds of different sources to tell the same story from different angles, and they don't strip away the contestation of it. If you see what I mean, they incorporate the contestation.
Yeah.
About motive, character, perspective, interests, whatever it is. But so I didn't think that we should be offering like a bowdlerized, simplified, kind of Disneyfied sort of version of our founding stories in Britain. I always felt that we should try and tell it as, it's a cliche, but as close as we can to what we think happened. And then, for me as a historian, my job is to tell that story. It's for others. To some degree, it's to others to kind of make out of it what they will. So it's not like entirely my responsibility to, I don't think it can be philosophically, but anyway, I wouldn't presume to have the responsibility of telling them that this is how you should understand this story. Do you see what I mean? I kind of want to leave it to them to make out of it what they will. And what I found is that quite often some people will say, oh, I really appreciate the fact that you've gone into all of this. Other people say, okay, but let's like skirt over that bit, and let's so people react in different ways. But I think to be true to myself, I feel that that's how, and also Hamid Mahmoud, my co-author, we felt that we had to try our best to do justice to the sources that we had, with Abdullah Quilliam, he's a complex character. There are things about him that are admirable, and there are things about him that are very, very questionable. And that comes across in a little bit in Fatima's story, because Fatima, she dies young at 35, and the way that it's officially kind of showing is that she kind of died as a lonely widow the last years of her life, and her previous husband who died had left her a son, but actually when we looked at the evidence, we found out that that's a kind of cover story. And it's most likely that the child was actually Abdullah Quilliam's child, and she was a kind of secret third wife of his, because he preached polygamy and he believed in it. He practiced it, what he preached. He wasn't hypocritical in that sense. But Fatima was, the first woman to convert to Islam in Liverpool. She was the one who co-founded the first mosque. She was the one who represented the community nationally, internationally, along with Quilliam. She was a very active caller to Islam. So 2 members of her family converted, her husband converted. Several women came to Islam at her hands. So she was a force in her own right, and very inspirational figure. A lot of young readers, and we're beginning to get feedback now, but a lot of young readers, even young readers as young as 12, young girls of young as 12, have picked the book up and really enjoyed it and got something out of it. You can read it in an evening. We wanted it to be accessible. Then all the kind of academic stuff is all at the back of the book, so it isn't there to get in the way of the story.
It doesn't interfere with the story, actually. That's one of the kind of, it's really interesting.
But what he's trying to hit that sweet spot of making it accessible, but also making it credible academically without it seeming academic. That's a kind of the trick, really, isn't it? I think.
Brilliant. So I think we've got 5 minutes. If we can just move on to some of the more recent work that you've actually been involved with, and then if we can open it up for question and answers, if that's okay. And this seems to be a really interesting area of work, you know, looking back and rereading history, or rereading history against the white gaze. If you can just share some of your thoughts and observations on this.
Yeah, I mean, we're just starting work on this now. This is a kind of collaborative project that I'm doing with my wife, Dr. Fawzia Burrows at the University of Leeds, and we're looking at the kind of untold story of Bradford's first Muslim community. And this was a village of 100 Somalilanders who were brought over to Bradford for the 1904 exhibition. And they were put on, quote unquote, on display in the park in the city, Lister Park, for 6 months. And it was the sensation of the exhibition, and something like 2.5 million people came from across the north to see the Somali village. You know, when the centenary came up in 2004, you know, the city was embarrassed about this, to put it bluntly. You know, it was seen as kind of an embarrassment, and I think it was a little bit glossed over at the time. And I think what we're interested in doing is trying to do something quite difficult, I think, which is not to duck the issue of the white racial gaze, of putting human beings, colonized peoples, on display. Because, I mean, this is a way in which, if it's the first time that for many of these white English people had seen a black person, they're being trained to see them in this context. And so we can't duck that. But at the same time, you know, as we're beginning our research, it's really obvious that these were not just victims. These were also, this was a whole village. These were people of agency. They had the chief was there. You had a hakim, a doctor. You had an imam. They did congregational prayers, probably the first congregational prayers in Bradford. And so it was a working village as well. And it seems that, you know, that they had some agency in how they conducted themselves in the village. It wasn't that they were being ordered around. So I think that, you know, it's going to be a very difficult exercise to try and get that balance right between being racialized and showing their agency. You see what I mean? It's a complicated mix of the two, and trying to get that right is going to be a challenge. And so I think we're seeking to partner with a Somalian historian who can help us recover the Somali archive, ideally of this village. But if we don't have that, at the very least, anyone else who the collective memory of these people going out to being put on in these shows, these road shows around Europe, because it wasn't just the British Empire that did this, it was also the French and others who did this for over a century in Europe. They brought colonized peoples and put them on display in exhibitions and such like. So you know, this is just part of the story that I think that we need to tell. So we'd like to put this into the 2025 City of Culture you know, experience in Bradford, maybe hopefully to set the record straight a little bit and bring a more complicated picture to bear on Bradford's history.
Fascinating, yeah. Okay, so I think we've okay, so 1:10. So if we can just open up the floor metaphorically to questions. I'm happy to take questions if anybody wants to ask direct questions. I know there's a lot of questions in the chat.
Shamim, do you want to unshare your screen so that
yeah. Stop sharing. Okay. Is anybody here that wants to ask any questions?
There are 2 in the chat, but I have one as well. Let him answer those 2 and then I'll ask.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a question here about how would you characterize British secularism? And in what ways does it differ from secularism practices, concepts in Germany and France? Yeah, so
it seems to sit across, it doesn't really seem to sit in with our conversation today.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
I mean, I would just say very briefly that there isn't one kind of secularism, and British secularism tended to be pluralistic, because for a couple of reasons. One is that the four countries within Britain never were assimilated into one. So you had, you know, Wales, Scotland, Ireland, and England, and they all had different forms of religious settlement and establishment. So that was one element of pluralism. And I think the other was that there was still an established church in England after the 16th century. So it wasn't a completely formally secular republic like America or France. But having said that, you know, British culture has become much more secular. We're officially a Christian minority nation now. For the first time, you know, under 50% of the population identifies as Christian. And I believe because of the large Muslim presence in Britain now, we've moved for various reasons I won't go into today, but we've moved to, I believe, to more of a French style of secularism. Yeah. So a laïque, which is calling for a kind of aggressive promotion of non-religion in the public sphere, and actually a disestablishment of religion in the public sphere. So I think that we're moving away from a distinctive sort of British style of secularism, which was a little bit more accommodating. I'm not saying it was ideal, but it had its own flaws. But I'm saying we're moving to more sort of aggressive style secularism that, say, would typify France more than, say, Britain, historically speaking.
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. Is anybody else any questions?
There's some questions in the chat, in the Q&A, isn't there?
I think those are the ones that, yeah.
Okay.
I think there's a comment for Yahya Birt. I mean, that's I don't know what the comment is. It just, it doesn't state what the comment is, by Akbar Ahmed. Akbar, do you want to come in and ask the question? I'm happy to.
There's one here. There are some here. What is the important forces of Sufism, Salafism playing in the third wave of conversions? Would you find progressive Islamic scholarship movement gaining momentum too?
Oh, yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that converts seem to have found a home across the whole of the House of Islam. Let me put it that way. So you find converts who are part of the progressive wing of Islam, Sunni Islam, and you find also the even historically the first wave of converts were very much, I think, attached to Islamic modernism, because that was the kind of part of the community they first really interacted with. And also there's reformist ulama. So again, you know, that's you find with people like Quilliam and Pickthall, you find that was the case. I think that there was a kind of countercultural radicalism in the second wave. I think a kind of strong anti-capitalist element, which I think is maybe less emphasized today, but certainly that was a feature in the second wave. So yeah, you've always had those elements, element there for sure. But I still think direct contact with Islamic, quote unquote, missionary movements has been probably the most important aspect of the third wave. So, you know, interacting with Salafis and Sufis and others and so on.
Fantastic. Yeah. Any other questions that people have? If not, I can ask a question. If that's okay.
I think Qaisra had a question as well.
Yes, yes, I have 2 or 3, in fact. This is at a personal level, really. What drew you to become a Muslim? And then obviously, what's been the most fulfilling part of entering Islam and being a Muslim? And then thirdly, any challenges? Obviously it must be difficult at first for your friends and family, you know, to see you convert to Islam. So if you don't mind sharing that.
Just out of interest, Qaisra, why do you want to know my personal story?
No,
what is it for you that asks once? Why do you find it important to ask the question?
Yeah, it's important because I want to know, what was it about Islam, or how did it come about that you joined Islam? It's the journey really I'm interested in.
Why are you interested in the journey?
I'm interested in you.
No, because I get asked this question a lot.
Really?
But I'd be quite interested to know why you're so interested in the story. I mean, above and beyond like me providing like this big picture of conversion and so on, yeah. You want to hone in on my personal story. But why is my personal story interesting? To say there are 1,000 conversion stories. But why do you want to hear my personal story?
It's up to you if you want to answer.
No, but I'm interested into why.
I find it fascinating. I really do. And I've asked this question of other people we've hosted. We do have panels regularly, and it's one of those things that we're interested in. What is it? What spurred them on? How did it come about? Was it an action, a person, a journey?
I'll tell you a story. I'll tell you a story that is part of my conversion story, but it's a bit pointed, this story, so I hope you don't mind. So the thing is that I after I converted, and I still wasn't fully practicing, you know, I'd converted, I went back to London, I'd stopped drinking, and I went to see some old school friends of mine in a pub. Okay, so I sat in the pub, and I was having my Coke or whatever it was. And a friend of mine who was British Pakistani, second generation, he said, "Jonathan, there's something about you. It's changed. I don't know what it is." I said, "Oh, I think I've sort of I've discovered, you know, religion. I've become spiritual." And I said, "Can you guess, you know, which religion it is?" And he said, "Some kind of evangelical Christianity." I said, "No." He said, "Buddhism?" No. He said, "Hinduism?" No. He went through every religion. And the last religion that he came to was Islam. Okay. And this is, you know, second generation British Pakistani Muslim asking me these questions. He couldn't believe that I picked Islam. And I did say to him, it's quite revealing that the last religion that you picked was your own. And he's, you know, and I think that there is, you know, for some Muslims, not all, but for some Muslims, behind this question of why did you convert to Islam is another question, which is, why would anybody convert to Islam? You know, people have their own struggles with their faith, and they look to converts to provide them that assurance or that kind of boost to their own iman, their own faith, that they feel is lacking in themselves, you know, and that converts can play that role to somehow to bolster their faith, you know. But I think it's really important for all of us to actually be self-introspective about our own journeys. You know, nobody can, we can't yes, we can inspire each other, but we can't bear each other's burdens either. You know, we're all going to have to make our own journeys to God at the end of the day. We all have to quote unquote convert if we haven't done so already. You know, faith cannot be just a genetic inheritance, something that's passed down with cooking recipes, you know, because we happen to be born into a Muslim family. We have to convert. Everybody has to convert to the truth of their faith. Whatever their background, born Muslim or not. And I think that is the real truth of the matter. And that's what I said to my, you know, that was the conversation that I had with my friend, you know, 30 years ago in that pub. You know, that he had to go on his own journey. And that, I think, is maybe what lies behind that kind of question that I get asked so often. So, you know, anyway.
Yeah, I think we have a question here from a question here from Maria Khan. I think questions about cosmopolitan Muslim communities in Britain. Is this paradigm applicable in Europe?
Yes, I think it is. I think that yes, that we are, the Muslim minorities are cosmopolitan and open. That is precisely why a kind of revived kind of ethno-nationalism that's sweeping Europe at the moment is afraid of that openness and what it represents, the alternative that it represents. And that's why Muslim communities are so often demonized. They don't want that openness and that multicultural, cosmopolitan kind of dynamism that Muslims in Europe represent. But we would be so much better off if that were embraced and not feared. And I think we have to find a way to turn the tables. Honestly, I want to fight for a Europe that is inclusive and not exclusive. And it has to come to terms, it has to come to love its Muslims, not to hate and fear them. There's no way around that. Yeah. They have to move to a kind of Islamophilia, rather than get away from the Islamophobia.
Can I mean, this is probably a separate discussion, but if you could just give a quick answer. It's a much more detailed answer, I kind of appreciate, but because you used the term cosmopolitanism, and this within the literature, there's various other ideas that scholars use, multiculturalism, conviviality, etc. So how do you define cosmopolitanism? I mean, how do you see the elements of cosmopolitan, especially given? That's the first question. The second question is it realistic? Because within Europe, there's countries that adopted multiculturalism have argued for the death of it, and even countries like Germany, who's never had a history of multiculturalism, also want to get rid of it as well. So,
look, of course, I understand, Shamim, by that it's a kind of stand that I'm taking, that's that stand against the prevailing political winds, as you so eloquently described them. But we have to stand for something, or we'll fall for anything, as the saying goes. You have to make a stand for what you believe in. Why I use cosmopolitanism, precisely because I believe that multiculturalism is kind of dead as a political terminology for various reasons. Not that I don't believe in what it could be at its best, but I guess I believe that I've lost faith in the project of genuinely inclusive nationalism. So I guess cosmopolitanism is partly my response to that. I'm trying to think in an ummatic way.
Okay.
And I think that I think that we should be open to all cultures as a sign of God's creativity. This is what the Quran is telling us. We recognize human cultures as a sign of God's creativity. We act ethically in the world. We act for everybody's common benefit, and we're not going to be bound by hyper-tribalisms, whether that's ethnic or nationalist or whatever. We have to remain open to what is human, and that has to be broad and inclusive. So for me, I guess cosmopolitanism is my term for moving away from narrow nationalism and even a kind of narrow sectarian Islam. The Ummah is a super tribe where it's the Muslims right or wrong. I also don't believe in that either. I believe that we are judged by our own ethical standards, and we have to bear witness against ourselves if we are unjust. Muslims, So this is not. I'm not calling for to replace one kind of super tribalism, nationalism, with another kind of super tribalism, which is ummatism. I'm not trying to do that either.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you.
I can see a comment from Professor Akbar Ahmed. So first of all, Yahya, brother, you're very lucky indeed. We've got Akbar Ahmed, professor, who is one of our panelists later, our author, filmmaker, scholar, joined us all the way from Washington. And then you've got someone, Bung, all the way from Indonesia. So it's a totally global sort of a panel, and I'm really pleased about that. Now, there's a comment from Professor Akbar Ahmed. He says, congratulations to you, brother Yahya. I would like to review your book. if your publishers can send me a review copy, that's Akbar Ahmad, and I'll connect you to him. So that's really great, isn't it?
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah, yeah.
He's the ambassador of Islam at large.
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic. So, I mean, Qaisra, do you have a time for another? I've got a few more minutes left, so if we can.
Yeah, 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes. Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
if we could, sorry, just look through the chat. There are a few more comments from Maria Khan.
I think I've raised it. Yeah, I've answered that.
Can you let us know which question she had, and then we can try and answer it? Because I hate to miss anybody out.
She did mention Krakow, Poland, my country, Poland.
Okay.
And what else did she say?
I think it's a question about you know, this theme that we've been, you know, trying to discuss about you know, indigenized Islam versus, you know, cultural Islam that's been, you know, transported either from, you know, the Indian subcontinent. So there's a tension there between, you know, what's authentic. Is it, you know, is Polish Islam more authentic or less, you know, authentic than, say, for example, Islam that's been, you know, brought over from the Indian subcontinent? So there seems to be like there's a tension there between, you know, between the two.
I mean, I would, with every fiber in my being, I would battle the idea of setting up these two in tension with each other. As I said, you know, earlier in our discussion today, I believe that in the third wave, we have a kind of dialogical model, a multicultural, cosmopolitan Muslim community, and whatever Polish Islam or British Islam is going to look like, it's going to be it's going to be cosmopolitan and open to many different, it's going to be like a biryani. It's going to be like a...
Is it a Hyderabadi biryani or...
that's a debate for another day, brother. Or it might be like kushari, you know, kushari. It's going to be a melding of different things coming together, which will seem like, you know, a bit anomalous, but we'll all grow to love it at some point as our own. So I don't think it's the idea that like the authentic Islam is going to be only can be practiced by white converts or whatever, you know. I think that this idea has had its day, even though some of our most prominent convert leaders in the West have still promoted hard or softer versions of that idea. I think that idea really needs to be knocked on the head.
I think that's the perfect time, actually, make it 50. So if we can just do a virtual round of applause to our dear brother Yahya Birt, and I wish you all the best for, you know, all the exciting projects to come, and you know, may we kind of continue from your, you know, wisdom, your teaching and your writing as well. On that note, I think if I can pass it over to the hosts, I think.
Thank you so much, Brother Shamim. You've been absolutely a fantastic host. Really enjoyed that. You kept us going with all the lovely, insightful questions. And of course, thank you so much to our speaker today, Yahya Birt. Another marvelous event, mashallah. Learned so much, heard so much, shared a lot, and kept us going and kept us thinking. And I'm delighted we have had panelists from literally around the world. So well done, everybody, and thank you so much. And my final thing is thank you to our attendees for giving us their time on Sunday. Please join us next Thursday for our live big event, celebration of 5 years of MACFEST and Muslim Women Art Festival with over 50 creatives, a whole day of lots of activities. So if you're in the Northwest, we'd love to have you there. So good afternoon, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Goodbye. And thank you to my team in the back for helping us to support this event. Assalamu alaikum.